have a great excuse to love fairy tales for so much longer. So anyway, I thought it would be nice. So originally with this quilt, so sometimes when you pick out binding, it can be a little overwhelming because you're like, do I match my border? Do I match my backing? Sometimes I just recommend people pick their favorite color. But originally I was like, oh, there's a lot of pink in this. I want it to be pink. So originally I was almost going to go with this type of pink, but that was just going to be way too bold. I got it cut and I put it next to it and I'm like, it's too much. And then I discovered this color of grunge, which really matches kind of the tips of some of these flowers. So sometimes finding a softer element also works really well, but I'm really happy with this color. So I did my method here, but I did it for hand binding. So when I hand bind a quilt, so what I do for all my quilts is I do 2 1/4 binding. I've experimented with lots of 2 1/2s, all kinds of stuff, but 2 1/4 to me just works the very best. So one of my big tricks to doing it is when you do 2 1/4 binding. I used to go through and I would cut my binding and then I would press my binding in half and then I would stitch it down and then I would stitch it to my quilt. And then I figured out those are really a lot of unnecessary steps. And so what I prefer to do is I do miter my binding together. And so when I overlap my pieces to do the mitering, I always go a little off so that when I have this angle here, I can clearly see my 45-degree angle and I don't get it off.
Turn it around so I can see.
So if it's, I really make sure that it is a generous overlap so I can clearly see that 45-degree line when I go to miter my pieces together. When I do miter my binding, I do lay it down and I always set the seam first. So it's really important to set the seam before you open it up to press it, because that not only the heat helps flatten the yarn of the thread, and so it makes it flatter, but that heat also is going to make you have a better crisp binding here. And then I personally recommend people don't press their mitered binding open. I really recommend pressing it to the dark side, and I recommend when you stitch this length to do a 2.0. So if your stitch normal is a 2.5, I recommend a tighter stitch so that, because this is going to get some torque when you're going to do binding. You'll hopefully support your quilt as much as possible, but the weight of your quilt is going to pull on this, and so it's just better to have a tighter stitch.
So you said
a 2.0
versus 2.5.
Mm-hmm. Yep, versus 2.5. Now, when you go to attach it, so I'll tell you machine binding first, because that's what my goal in life is to make as many quilts as possible, which requires machine binding. So anyway, when you go to attach your binding, you always want to start, and I did this side a little bit earlier this morning, you want to start at a minimum of 20 inches away from the end of your quilt. So part of that is because, hey Trish, you want to have at least an 8 to 10 inch piece here that's a tail, and you want to leave that at the beginning, and you're going to leave it at the end. And so if you have an 8 to 10 inch tail here and an 8 to 10 inch tail here, if you don't have at least 20 inches, you're going to be just a little more cramped than it should be. So when you go to start attaching your 2 1/4 binding, it's going to be well pressed. You will have pressed your mitered seam, and you're going to start attaching it to your quilt. So I prefer to stitch mine when I do machine binding, to stitch it to the back first and roll it to the front to top stitch it. So when I go to stitch it on the machine, I am just going to nicely keep it loose and hold it in my hand, and I stitch about 5 to 8 inches at a time when I go to do it. So I just have a finger hold that's about like this when I go to press it. So again, I haven't pre-pressed this. It's nice and flush, and I haven't stitched it down. So the really important thing when you go to attach your binding is you want to make sure you're attaching your binding with a 1/4 inch piecing foot. So if you do 2 1/4 binding, what you basically do is you take out your margin for error. And so if you do 2 1/2 binding attached with a 2 1/4, the top of your binding is like too generous on top, and what happens is you get more of your stitching shows on the back. So 2 1/4 just reduces that excess, and it works out just fine. So anyway, the big thing is to use a 1/4 inch piecing foot when you go to attach it. So I personally sew on a 3100 or the Luminaire, and so they have the dual feed move it foot, and they have the 1/4 inch piecing foot. So, the 3100 Quilt Club machines come with all the move it foot extra feet, but even the Luminaire doesn't come with all of the move it feet.
It's okay.
So anyway, so if you use this 1/4 inch piecing foot, you're going to have a really accurate attachment. And so I'm just going to go ahead and for fun, and we'll just do a little bit of this on Bonnie's machine because we can't.
Did you say you start on the back?
Oh, and you have that on your machine already?
Mm-hmm.
I start on the back. Mm-hmm. Because I prefer to top stitch. So I'll show you this part here first, since some of you guys are videoing. So when I go to attach it on the machine, I lengthen my stitch length. So I lengthen my stitch length to a 3.0 when I attach my binding. Because when you're doing that, when you're attaching binding, you're going through the layer fabric, your layer of batting, and your backing. And depending on the loftiness of your batting, whatever it is, you have a lot of excess bulk. And so if you leave your stitch length on normal, it's gonna look tiny because of the thickness of your machine. And your machine is also gonna have to work harder to go through those layers, and your machine is not going to stitch as fast as it normally would because it's having to go through all those layers. So if you can give your stitch a 3.0, it will go so much faster through your machine, you'll be surprised. And I have yet to ever have binding fall off a quilt. So it's you're just attaching it because you're gonna reattach it. You're gonna be top stitching it again, and so it's really not gonna come off your quilt with a 3.0 stitch length. If you are stitching cuddle binding, it's a whole nother game, but it's the same thought. You would do a 3.0 or a 3.5 depending on how cuddly your cuddle fabric is. If it's a simple low loft cuddle, a 3.0 is still probably going to be fine, but a 3.5 is also going to be just as fine because again, the loftiness of your material is going to make a longer stitch look normal. So that's why it's important, because you don't want those micro tiny stitches when you're working on a project, because it's just going to make you do, and your machine do more work than it needs to do. So when you go to attach your binding, it doesn't really matter what color of thread you have on because it's going to be covered up. But what I typically like to do when I attach my binding is I try to do the same thing I'm going to top stitch it with when I go to attach it. So when I select the thread color for my binding, because we're top stitching, is I'm going to try to find the color that will melt the most into the fabric. So for this fabric, I think I brought it in my bag. It might have left it on my machine, but I picked this kind of medium color of pink that's in the straight binding. Really colorful binding, you can get away with a lot of different ones, but if I would have chosen a bright lipstick red, it would have been too much of a pop, but it also at the same time, like, this is a fun quilt that has lots of personality, so why would I care if it had red? It would be fun. And if you wanted a whole nother look, you can do a contrasting thread. But typically we don't want to draw a lot of attention to our binding. The binding purpose is to cover up your batting so that it doesn't show through. So for this quilt, I just chose a light lavender was the color I used. So because we know we're gonna top stitch, sometimes you can get away with using the same color on the top as you do the bottom. But every once in a while we'll get a quilt where it's really colorful on the front, but we've put a really light color on the back. So if we pretended, so this is a great choice for wide back because it's so colorful. It matched the front of my fabric, and this red pink binding is going to be just fabulous on it, right? It's because the last retreat group bought all of it.
Oh,
and then
that's
they even
why I
had to
didn't
go
see
online
it.
to buy more. It was
one called?
biblical. I'll have to look it up and tell you because I have a screenshot of the SKU because they had to buy it online. I mean, some of them got it at our
Would
store.
you send it to one of us?
Yes.
Are you
I'll
gonna
send
order
it
it
to
again?
Bonnie or Carol because
Okay.
I have them in my personal phone. Anyway, so when you go to top stitch this, So I can use the same pink on the top as I do the bottom because the pink is not going to show through here at all. And we can see in this section that I've already done, you barely see it. So that's a good thing. If this would have been a lighter color like this backing, then I would have my pink on top and I would have a cream color on the bottom. Because when we do top stitch our binding, every once in a while, we're gonna hit it perfectly and it's almost gonna be in the ditch right there. But every once in a while, it could either stitch on the back of your binding or a little bit offside. If you have 2.5 inch binding, it will for sure end up being on the back of your project. And that is what a lot of people struggle with. So 2 1/4 can kind of reduce that, but also just color matching your bobbin thread to match your backing is also gonna fit the same bill. Because here, we'll find that later, but I'll show you where it stitches on the back and you just can't even tell. So when you go to attach it to the back, it's really, really important to make sure that you have the weight of your quilt is on top of your surface. So for me in my quilt room, I have a window right here and my ironing board is right here. So I move to my dining room table or go to the quilt shop to bind my quilts for space. But no matter where you are, you want the weight of your quilt to be up here. If you let the weight of your quilt drag more, not only is it frustrating, but the weight of it can actually move the needle bar in your machine, and you can have to have it bring it in for repair because it can move your needle bar. So that's just multiple reasons why you should, pay attention to that part.
Ahead. Do you only do small sections and then top stitch too, or? Do
No,
you do
I just
all
did
of
that to show the class before I came over here. So I'll go the whole way around the quilt before I start top stitching it. But that's a great question.
And then I'm going back here.
So, so the other thing, so I'm on Bonnie's Luminaire, but I'm going to lower my foot pedal. I like to use this pivot function. So a lot of machines have a pivot function where if you have it pressed, it will, when you take your foot off your foot pedal, it will barely pop up the foot of your machine. And there's plenty of people that don't know that exists. So I'm going to increase this stitch length to a 3.0 because of this. And I just finger, we're totally good. You have the fancy foot. What am I doing here?
I do.
You have is it programmed?
Yeah.
There we go. You can also do, so you want to lengthen your stitch length, but I just hold it with my hands like this. So it's not wasting time, but I do not take the time to clip or pin or glue my binding. If you have pressed your wrinkles out ahead of time, and you have it just loosely in your lap or whatever, I guide it with my hand to the left, but your walking foot should be doing the bulk of the work to move it through your machine. If you don't have as much grip, if you have those free motion gloves on, you can put those on when you're guiding it so that you have, so it helps you get more, it just will help you guide your machine. So I'm just gonna go ahead and snip that just to show you this purpose. So you can see here with this contrasting thread, I've got an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And so when you go to roll your binding over like this, part of why I also like 2 1/4 binding is some of you might have ever done competition quilts. But whenever and some of you are like, oh, I've never done that, but I've thought about it. So one of the big things that with competition quilts is they actually will feel your binding. And so your binding really needs to be full. If you use 2 1/2 or you don't have it firmly rolled over, you can get this gap where it's just and it just doesn't feel as nice, but it also wears harder. Like your binding will wear out faster if you have that gap there and if it's not full and tight. So I have found it wears out faster, and it just has a little bit more of a flange. Now, if you're putting binding on something that's going to have a lot of high use and you are going to launder it frequently, like placemats or something like that, I really do recommend people do bias binding, which is a whole nother thing, because bias binding is going to wear the best because of how the fibers are. And so even if you have it nice rolled and tight. Bias is going to help high use things wear better. Or you'll just have to do it, you'll just have to add more binding again, which again is not a big deal. Like if binding wears out, I would personally just recommend stitching another layer on top of it. I wouldn't take the time to rip it out because that's going to cause more wear on your existing threads. So when we go to do the top stitching part, we're going to just hand roll it like this. For me, I have plenty of finger strength, and so what I do is I just do, that's my tail actually though, isn't it? Did I stitch down the wrong part? No, I'm fine. Okay, so when we go to top stitch this part here, we would have had all of this would actually be connected to the quilt, but I just finger press it and hold like this, and this is where I use the other foot. So I use the stitch in the ditch foot when I top stitch my, it's amazing. This is life changing.
Yes,
So
I
this
love that
was
one.
a happy accident because I couldn't find the foot I normally use, and I just badly wanted to finish this quilt. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna try this out. So what a stitch in the ditch foot does is this guide that's in the middle, it's gonna hug your layer so that it's just gonna go right on top of it. But how this works best, so I'm just gonna take this off and put it right here. So when you do the stitch in the ditch foot,
I have a question.
yes,
Does that stitch in the ditch foot come with the Luminaire one?
it does not. It is an
So-
extra foot that we sell at Beehive
Or does
Quilt
it
Shop.
fit on any machine?
It,
Okay.
huh?
The one that kind of looks like that, even with the Dream Machine, it's not a stitch in the ditch, it's a little different.
Yeah, there's like 5 different dual feed move up foot feet. So there's a couching foot, a 1/4 inch piecing foot, an open applique foot, the classic one that comes on the machine, and a stitch in the ditch foot. So, but they all have this big opening. So the big thing with move it foot is when you have it plugged into your Brother machine, it will gray out anything you can't do. And so you don't have to worry about accidentally doing the wrong foot. You do want to make sure that it's actually plugged into your machine. Because one time I was binding a quilt and I was like, why isn't this working? And then I realized I hadn't plugged it in, and that's why it wasn't feeding it through. Another thing is people can accidentally move. There's a little lever over here on the side, and that can change. The height. It actually makes it so that the rollers are engaged or they're not engaged. Like it lifts it up. Just don't move it. Or if it's not working, flip it the other way. Yeah. So the big thing is you're putting your stitch in the ditch foot on. Anyway, so
Is that the embroidery foot that you have on that?
no, it's called the dual feed move it foot.
What
That's
machine is that?
this is Luminaire 2.
Okay.
3. Well, it is upgraded to a 3, but yes, you're right. I see you, Bonnie. So this is a 3. So the big thing, if a stitch in the ditch foot, your needle is typically in the center position, but we don't want it in the center position. We need it to be a little offset so that we're top stitching. So the thing we're going to do is we're going to keep our stitch length on a 3.0, but we're going to increase the left-right shift so that it moves the needle a little bit over to the right. So we,
How much do you move it over?
I move it over so that it's, let's see, let me just make sure. I have a screenshot on my phone. And I'm gonna keep it with this cream thread so that you can see it, but I'm going to rip it out and put real pink thread on it later. So I have right now I've got it at a 4.5, and that's about perfect.
Yep.
So I just hold it with my finger. Again, I have the weight of my quilt on the top, and I'm just
Does that
putting
have
pressure on it
7?
here.
4.5, is it a 7-stitch width maximum on that machine?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I
Yes. So the big thing is you just wanted a few millimeters offset.
I got it.
So I'm gonna, yeah.
Put it
So
back in there, let's see what you got.
yeah. So that's how you can see. So that's how far I'm top stitching.
Nice, okay.
So if you go any closer than that, you're just gonna run a frequent risk of accidentally stitching on the inside of the line, which you can always go back again and top stitch. But the big thing, so like when we quilt, like we quilted this quilt on our Gamel long arm at the store, And so most of the time your quilter is going to have a basting stitch on the edge of your quilt. And so what you really want to make sure is that when you're pulling your binding forward, that you are covering up whatever basting stitch or sew that you have. If your basting stitch from your long armor is too far in, you can pull that out ahead of time or seam rip it later. It's not a big deal, but that's what I always shoot for, is to pull it over and do that. So again, if you have 2 1/4, it's just, you're gonna pull it over. You're gonna pull it over and as much as you can.
Could you put that back in the machine?
Yes.
And just put the foot down so I can see where it sets?
Yeah. So
and the
yeah,
needle?
if you're looking, just
I'm gonna take a picture.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
so. Yeah, so Brother also makes a foot that's called a dynamic walking foot, and you can a good thing to test it too is if you just put your needle down, that's going to show you how inset you are, and you can. Yep, you can take whatever close-ups you want. My nails even look good, huh?
Mine's a
Husqvarna. So you can. So if you've at least attached your binding with the walking foot, and you have it done there, you could put a normal stitch in the ditch foot on if you wanted it. But most brands of machines, depending on what model you get, a lot of them, like Bernina, people call it a click. You move it over a couple clicks. Brother calls it a left-right shift. Some of the more simple Brother machines actually have a button where you can press it and your stitch speed becomes your needle placement. And so that's another way to have a left-right shift if you don't have the really detailed settings.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So these feet, they go with the walking.
They go with the they go
So
with
it
them.
senses and tells you if you can't use or can use on your screen.
Yes.
Right.
Mhm.
Now, so if you took your walking foot off, though, then someone could use a regular stitch in the ditch foot if they wanted to.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So this is a stitch in the ditch foot.
All right.
Mhm. And so
And I'll share. This is actually, I think,
That way, when I ask that,
a walking. Yes.
okay.
So
I think that goes to my brother.
yeah. So you like this stitch in the ditch foot, like it has a little needle placement thing. So if you do have a metal bar through your stitch in the ditch foot, you want to make sure that you're checking your needle, maybe even with your hand wheel, before you start stitching, so that you don't stitch through that little needle place.
What is
So-
this? This originally came with
That
the
is a stitch in the ditch foot.
Okay,
yeah.
but it's not for that.
No, so this is
Okay.
why. So the Brother machines that can have this foot, because honestly, this foot is worth it. If you make a lot of quilts and bind stuff, this foot is life changing, because otherwise, if you have a normal walking foot, you really do have to pull it through, and your machine should be doing that work. It really should.
if you
So-
don't have a walking foot, you mean?
Yeah, you have to pull, and then if you pull too much, you can break a needle, and if you're breaking needles, you're either having too much tension or you need a bigger needle. But it's just a lot easier if you have a walking foot. So if your walking foot is like Julie's, and it's just a one type of walking foot, you're gonna need to figure out where on your machine is 1/4 of an inch if you don't have one of these ones to pop on. But that's why these make so much sense.
Too, I think.
Yeah. So Brother also makes one. So not every machine can have a move it foot in it. So the Brother machines that can have it are the 2400 and the 3100 Brother Quilt Club machines. The Dream machines. Most Dream machines came with the move it foot.
That's
It's
what I
just a
thought.
lot of people also.
You can
I've
buy
just
them.
Don't know how to
discovered.
use it.
Yeah, they just have never had to
you
use
can
it.
buy more of them.
But these feet literally snap on.
I was about to say, how does it connect?
What's the difference
There's no way
between
it'll
move it
connect to my
foot and
machine,
walk
huh?
it foot?
So a move it foot is actually where it plugs into the back of your machine, and you have to, and just like a normal, like this is the ankle, what is this called actually, the shank.
Shank.
I always refer to it as an ankle, because if you think of your ankle attaches a foot, to me that makes more sense than a shank, because that just sounds like a knife to me. Anyway. Yeah, so this is gonna attach, your normal feet. So if you don't have a walking foot, you can attach it with a 1/4 inch normal foot. You just may have to have more guidance up here. A move it foot actually has to plug into the back port of your
Cause it goes
machine.
with the walking.
I have a question.
And the walking.
It's only for Brother machines, but it's my Brother's amazing.
Well, like I use
No.
a lot of my brother feet on my Husqvarna.
Oh, it has
but
to
that's
plug into this
electronic.
port. It's an electronic component. But here's the kicker. Brother just invented one that's called the dynamic walking foot. I did not bring one over here. I don't know if anyone here has one, but it is a chrome walking foot. And so the big thing with these move it feet is that it grays out the stitches you can't do. So even though it has a 7mm opening, there's a bunch of stitches that can't be done on it. It grays it out so you don't do it.
Is that because your walking foot device is sensing that?
Yes,
So it lets it
it
know.
knows it's plugged in, and what it is this foot is not designed to hop around to do decorative stitches. It has a belt driven, so it's trying to do an even feet. You can do zigzags, a serpentine stitch, and several other things.
But not 7
But
wide.
nothing that hops around a lot.
Yeah.
So Brother heard from customers that they still wanted to do decorative stitches on thick projects. And so if you try to do a decorative stitch on a thick project on a normal foot, it does not do a great job because it's not helping you with the thickness of your material or anything. So Brother made the dynamic walking foot. I think it's like foot SA 101 or something. We have a lot of them at Beehive. But it actually allows you to do all the decorative stitches in your machine. So it's a low shank walking foot. So for luminaires, dream machines, any high shank machines, there is a special thing in your accessory box that is
It's a shank spacer,
shanks,
yeah.
and it makes your high shank a low shank machine so you can attach your dynamic walking foot on it. So then the dynamic walking foot uses the same features that the move it foot has, and it has snap-on feet. So you can have a normal Brother, a simpler machine, and have a dynamic walking foot and get stitch in the ditch and 1/4 inch piecing foot for that walking foot.
But you're saying you can use those with the dynamic walking foot?
It
or
has
they have
its
their
own dynamic walking feet has its own things that are like this
Right.
because there's less than 10 machines that Brother makes that
Right.
these fit on.
Right.
I have one question. I've always called this a walking foot, so if I have a luminaire one, so is the move it, is that a different
The move it foot and the dual feed foot are the same foot.
as is what I'm calling
What
a walking?
yeah, a
foot?
walking. This is not a walking foot. It is I call it a walking foot on steroids.
Oh, okay.
A traditional walking foot
That's
has
a dual feed.
yeah. This is a dual feed
And did I
or
get
move
that
it
with my
foot.
So it's a dual feed walking.
I don't think
dual feed
luminaires came with just your standard, everyday, ordinary walking foot.
No,
but
but
your
they came with
luminaire
the-
one does have a move it foot.
Okay, mine looks like that.
Right,
Yes,
so
I
we
just
have
wondered
Dream came
if-
with.
Yeah, so
Dream
You
came
have that
with
part, I think.
yeah, the
you plug that
Dream
also.
comes with it. All the
Okay.
luminaire series come with it, but not all the luminaires come with all the feet.
Right. So you have to
So those are sold separately.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Of course.
So I have to do with that foot, get the ditch and
You
the
would need to
stitch in the
buy
ditch?
this foot and the 1/4 inch. This is the 1/4 inch piecing one, and
Can I see the 1/4 inch piece?
Yes. Oh, that's the same one. This is Bonnie's because she had it on her machine because she uses
Oh,
it.
this is a 1/4 inch
Yeah, so
piecing?
I use
Yeah.
it all the time.
Yeah, hers
Even
is just
piecing.
hers is more used than mine. But this is the stitch in the ditch
Because
one.
it just pulls better.
So this is the two different ones I use.
Yeah, I have both.
So
of
I
those, but
attach it
just
with
wanted-
this, and then I use this with the left-right shift. So unlike a normal stitch in the ditch foot, some of those will have that little metal bar.
Yeah, the only difference is the.
But this whole
the
opening
bar
is flexible.
yeah.
So this just helps you guide it. And
You
so
want the 1/4 inch
the
and
left-right
then the,
shifting, it just
stitch
helped
in the
me
ditch.
make it a more standard
This is 1/4
top
inch.
stitch is what I found out because it hugged the seam. Up until when I experimented with this, I would top stitch with like the open one. But I just had to constantly make sure that I was about an eighth of an inch or so in.
And you weren't always perfect.
Yeah, and so the having the left-right shift just makes it a more standard, even top stitch. And lengthening your stitch length makes a huge world of difference because if you try to top stitch binding with a 2.5, your machine just has to work so much harder than a
That's what you put it
3.1.
on with the 3.5.
Yeah, so you
also.
the
What size needle do you prefer when you're doing that?
I have just used whatever is in my machine. I try not to use a microtext when I do binding. So I try to use a universal, like an 11, 12, you know. If you're going to do cuddle, I would recommend a 14 just because, again, you're going through all those thicknesses. But if you notice that your machine is skipping top stitches, that means you have too small of a needle and you need to put in a larger needle for those top stitches.
So you said the Dream Machine comes with that.
Yeah, it comes with this foot.
I just need to get.
What size did you say needle? 80, 90?
And yeah, an 80-12 is going to work perfectly fine. Unless you're binding a denim quilt and then go big.
Yeah.
But my kind of rule for needles is if it's not breaking, it's fine. And you know, but if after you bind a quilt or after you piece something, that's probably time to change your needle because your needle is going to be worn out by the time it's been done binding. And needles are really cheap, and so it is important to your machine is going to stitch so much nicer. And you can start hearing a dull needle. Like I can hear a dull needle now, and it really does make a difference. So,
Tell me if I have a dull needle.
oh, look at you. Oh, you're embroidering though. You're
Oh,
embroidering.
it's not on that.
Yeah.
Bonnie asked
But
me if I
8
changed
hours.
my needle. I said, no, I haven't broke it yet.
Yeah, but it like your stitches. I mean, if things look pretty, if it cosmetically it's fine, you're fine.
Okay.
But it will stitch better. It will stitch better with the sharp needle. So if you like at a retreat, like you guys are sewing more than 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
So I would be changing your needle once a day.
I think.
I really would.
Yeah.
They're $1 a needle.
I know. Yeah. It's
And
worth
I mean,
a
your
huge
needle
difference.
works
I need to change
so
mine.
hard. And so it's just like life is too short to cut with a dull rotary cutter.
Yeah, for
It
sure.
really is. That is
It
that
is.
is more torque on your whole body. You really need to have
Drives
a better.
me crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, I hate
I
that.
mean,
I do.
it's just like you deserve to have a
Yeah.
sharp blade.
Yeah.
Just like
No
we
one's gonna
deserve to
give
go
you an
shopping
award
down there at
for
the Beehive.
making a
Go
rotary
back.
blade last longer. You know.
No.
And there's all
Yeah.
yeah.
What was the pivot thing that you said on here?
You had it turned on your machine. It's this
that.
one.
Okay, that's what it's
So
called.
when
Yeah,
I
love that.
So this is I have 2 other tips, and then
So
I
the
have to go
pivot
take
just
that
stops it
casserole out.
down, stops with needle down.
Yeah,
is
so
that what she meant?
yeah, you can't turn the pivot on if your needle's up. So my other big
I
recommendation.
love that
Does the
pivot
pivot-
thing.
I'm sorry, and I was a little
No.
late. But the pivot, you're not talking about just where the needle position is. What does the pivot do?
It barely pops the foot up.
Oh, that's
So
right.
if instead of having your foot go, this will make your foot go all the way up. You don't want it to go all the way up. You just want it to barely pop up.
It's great when you're turning a corner and you're piecing.
You
the
just stop
bottom
it.
and
Yeah,
you'll turn-
it just really. This is the pivot
Okay.
foot.
Okay.
It just releases pressure.
We didn't
Thank
get
you,
a
Shannon.
1/4-inch foot
Thank you
for our
Move it.
Upgrade.
Dual feet.
dual feed.
Mm-mm. No, you would have received the couching dual feed foot when you bought your XP2 upgrade. So,
Wait a minute, you're saying, okay.
and the couching one I didn't even bring with me. The couching one is the one that's a lot like this, but instead of having a bar, it has a hole here, and
Yeah.
it's for threading yarn through the foot.
Yeah,
Let me
I saw
see
that
the
video.
branch
If you
that
come
and
to the
other
store today, I'll show you how to do
have
couching.
them, right?
I saw the video.
Do we get 10% off on those, or is that just fabric?
Just fabric.
She wiggles her eyebrows. Did you guys have a list of your classes at your
It's on the website. I aspire to have a
That's
paper
better.
printout,
Well,
but
I
it's
like it.
online.
I kind of prefer website because I love
Yes.
the paper.
So you can look by the calendar function and you'll see an actual calendar and it'll show you the things, or you can list the all calendars
goes to her.
and then you'll see the whole long list. So my one other tip, because I left all my leftover pieces, when you go to attach your binding, so a lot of people struggle with having crisp corners, right? You know, that line up really nice. So the best way I have figured out how to do it, and you guys might have other tricks, is when I go to attach my binding, which you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit, but I would be attaching it from the back side first. So I would have my strip that would come here. And what you want to do is, instead of taking your 1/4 of an inch and stitching all the way straight down, once you get here, you want to angle to the corner. So you want to kind of, when you get about a 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch away, you want to cheat it and go scant. And so when you dive, so if you can see here,
Oh, yeah.
do you see how that angles down in the corner?
Yeah.
So what I prefer to do is I prefer to go from a 1/4 inch and then I angle down, and then what I do is I actually will go ahead and cut my thread, and I'll sew off the fabric. I'll cut it, and then I will start stitching an accurate 1/4 inch this way. But what this allows you to do when you angle in is that you have a better chance of, when you go to do this part, so this is for hand binding, you have a better chance of folding this all the way and then folding this up in a corner and having a really nice piece.
So
And
you're
so
angling off
you
the binding and
if-
then starting with your 4th inch.
So if you struggle with having a crisp point, a lot of times that's because you've sewn an accurate 1/4 inch all the way to the edge, and you have too much bulk in this corner to have enough to fold over. And so if you have done other ones where you've stitched a whole 1/4 inch, then a lot of times I've even had to snip this tip of my batting off to have enough room to pull this over.
So you cut your thread
Right.
then and just start over with
So
a straight
yeah,
1/4.
so you're gonna get this nice beautiful tip like this
Oh, yeah.
every time if you angle down into this corner. That just gives you just enough to have
So you sew it less than a 1/4.
less than a 1/4. You
Use
just
it to the
dive.
corner.
You just dive off the edge.
To the point,
through
to
the
the
edge.
point,
About-
Teresa.
Is it
She
about
comes
an inch
off to the
up?
point.
Mm-hmm.
And then when she cuts it, and when she starts again, she does the
An
straight
accurate
1/4.
1/4.
But it just kind of goes straight to the corner.
But
of
it's
the quilt.
it's just enough. And so one of these corners, I can show you what the hand binding. Here we go. So this, so I mean, it's not perfect, but my goodness, it's perfectly nice.
Wow.
So,
Looks so
and that's
nice.
while watching television and only paying partway attention.
You were
so-
hand stitching that
Yeah,
one?
so this one's hand stitched. So that's
Girl.
that's how I do hand binding. It's not the prettiest, but it's also not too bad. And I've been using the tulip Hiroshima needles that Tula Pink likes to use for English paper piecing. I've been using those for my hand binding, and it has a really tiny eye, but I just use a little threader, and I really do like how it goes through. Otherwise, I have used Scarlet Today needles, have a really sharp tip, and it makes it really easy to catch.
Scarlet Day.
Do you have
Scarlet
those over there?
Today, they're Matchbox needles, and so they look like they're in a Matchbox piece.
But you have them at the Beehive?
So just lay them out on the counter so when everybody comes in.
Yeah. I honestly, we can do that.
What was the first needle you said?
Tulip makes, they're in a blue package. They're the sewing needles, but they're the Hiroshima
You're
needles.
saying tulip?
Tulip, the
Pink.
brand, yeah, is
Oh,
tulip
okay.
like the flower. They're Japanese. They are the very best. I mean, they're very excellent hand needles. So they make chenille needles, for wool. They make straw needles that have the hollow tip, which are also good for
The ones you
binding.
use are for paper piecing.
Yeah,
normally.
but the ones I have, I use them. I like them for binding because this is my sew together bag. I don't know how many of you have made this that are here. You made this, Bonnie? Not
I
yet.
have the kit.
So this is not. Again, I'm a utilitarian. This was my first one I made. The second one I made is much even better pieced, and it's at the store. But I mean, this I just got back from vacation, so I've not reorganized it. No judgment here. But you have 4 compartments, and then you have 3 zipper pieces. So I keep my extra needles, and I just put a new rotary blade. So I have my rotary blades, and then some people will do big stitching on their binding too for fun, and Primitive Gatherings makes a really great big stitch needle that has a big eye that's meant more for 12 weight thread or embroidery floss. And then I've just I also keep needles like that.
Primitive.
Primitive Gatherings. Oh, I didn't get that cap back on. I have featherweight bobbins. I must have decided I liked this selvage when I was working on something, but
What's the best
What
scissors
here's
that
my
you...
tulip
What
needles.
size needle is the primitive gathering one?
These are the Hiroshima ones.
Oh, but your primitive gathering.
Oh,
those
they
those are
make
for
big stitch and they make binding needles.
Okay.
and both of them are good, but they are in these little tiny tubes.
Bonnie, I changed my name. I have to put it.
Oh, good.
I would be.
And so this is and so I'm binding it with this fun variegated thread because I can. Oh, and look, I did bring my thread. But anyway, so the only other thing I didn't show you, and I got to go take that casserole out, is when I go to connect my pieces. I mean, since you guys are expert quilters, I think you guys can picture this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, right.
I'm tempted. Here, I'm just gonna cut this off. We're gonna use our imagination. Okay, so imagine we have our 8-inch tail here, and imagine we have our 8-inch tail sewn together here, and we need to connect our binding pieces. So this is something a lot of people struggle with. So if we have our 8-inch tail here, we've sewn all the way to this edge, and we have our 8-inch tail here that we pretend is attached to this quilt. So what you do is you have this excess here, and this is, going to be attached something like this. You want to line up this piece here and this piece here as a flat piece, like this. Okay? You want to make sure your quilt is very flat so you don't have any excess or you're holding it too tight. But so we're going to pretend this is very flat. And then what you do is you measure 1 inch from this piece and 1 inch from this piece. And you're going to slice it. So I like to use the So Fine stitch piece here. But again, we're going to use our imagination for the purpose of this video and the casserole.
So you're not doing a diagonal?
I am going to do a
Oh,
diagonal.
you are, okay.
Okay, so I have pretend these are 2 accurate 1-inch pieces. That's pretty close eyeballing wise. So then what you're going to do is you're going to take this and you're just going to twist it, and then you're going to do that diagonal. And there's something about 1 inch on this side and 1 inch on this side and that diagonal, and it lines up perfectly. I have tried it on 2.5 and 2 1/4, and somehow they both work. I don't ask questions to the math. I just follow it.
So you go from
So then you
that
would
where they
stitch here to
round into
here,
where they
then you
meet.
would slice this corner off, and then this is gonna lay perfectly flat, and you're gonna have that nice crisp mitered piece. So I just learned that technique from Jan Brody, who learned it from her mentor. There's tons of different tools, there's lots of different rulers, but I've done the whole thing where I did about the same thing, except for I would finger press this here, and then I would just sew it down as a straight seam. But you do just have so much more bulk in that than you do if you can get that miter diagonal. And
Cut them up, fold them, cut 1 inch off each end.
Off each end.
And
Does it
then
matter
twist.
if you did a wider
stitch,
border?
snip, and good.
If you did a wider border, like if you had a 2.5-inch border,
They both work somehow.
it somehow works.
I don't know. They just, but I'll do the 2 1/4 method, which I just really recommend. So if you've been 2 1/2, I recommend you to convert to a 2 1/4.
Okay,
It's
I'll
worth
try
it.
I'll try it.
So
Yes,
those,
because I
oh,
think
thank you.
that's really true.
So
that-
those are my binding tips and tricks.
Awesome. Love
What's
it.
the price of the ditch, the stitch in the ditch or ditch in the stitch?
I think these Move It feet, they're 25-ish,
They're not
May
terrible.
30. They're less than 30.
Yeah.
And they're
think
more
they're
than 20. They're
25.99.
20, yeah, they're 24 or 20. Okay, 25, 20, there's something.
Yeah, something
okay.
like that.
But
I just didn't
it
wanna
just
have
makes
to
the binding process so
I had
much
enough cash
easier.
to
Yeah.
be able to get that foot.
Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty.
What time are you
That's
doing
all I
couching
needed.
down there?
I'll just do it whenever you got, probably 3. We could pretend 3. If you
Okay,
come over 3, I'll
3-ish.
show you. And I can
Okay.
show you on the luminaire.
Okay,
Because I have a
perfect.
video.
online.
And what brand
stupid
scissors
things
do you recommend?
Huh?
What brand scissors do you recommend that you like?
Perfect
like
scissors
that.
are my favorite.
This one,
Perfect.
yeah, this.
So
what is that
the
lady?
purple, these are Perfect Scissors by Karen K. Buckley.
Yeah, those
So
are
the
really
purple ones are straight and sharp. The purple ones are micro serrated and sharp.
So you recommend the purple one? Is this purple?
Well, there's
pink.
this size and
Yeah.
purple and pink. The pink one is just a straight up sharp blade, but the purple one that's this size is micro serrated like the blue one.
Oh.
So it's
I
not
like the
pink just
serrate.
to be pink. One is sharp and one is
Oh.
micro serrated.
So purple. Okay, remember purple, Kara. Okay.
So
Purple scissors. Purple scissors. Got it.
yeah,
Yeah, how could you
purple,
forget-
purple, purple.
You know, that is true. I do